Okay, should be good.
And we're live. Okay, very good. Again, thank you all for coming out tonight to this April presentation of the Scottish Heritage Center's lecture series. Tonight is going to address a topic that is pretty much unknown here in Laurinburg and surrounding areas, and perhaps better known in Scotland. In fact, live tonight, I think there's a couple of watch parties going on and at Islands of Skye, the Island of Skye tonight. Some descendants of folks that came out here to Laurinburg who we're going to be talking about and telling you the story of are watching tonight or tuning in later. And so I'd like to say a special welcome to those folks who may be online with us tonight. So let me start off and see if we can dim the first light there so we can see the board here well enough. I'm going to put on our readers here and we're going to start with our presentation. So the failed immigration of 1884. And you're going to see there an image of people that were would have been very typical of the people that would have come out here as part of this planned migration. You see they're living there in thatched huts. You would have called those black houses in the Highland tradition. As you said, they don't have a chimney on them. They simply have an opening in the roof where the peat smoke would drift out. So they became very black on the inside. Two typical looking Highland people there around the time that these people would have come out to North Carolina. So let's get started. North Carolina in the early 1880s. You might think about what is going on at this time and what events may have led for local citizens to recruit a new party of Highland Scots to begin settling in this area a generation or more after many of them had been here previously. All right, first off, we know, of course, that the American Civil War has taken its toll on the region. We know Sherman's army came right through this neck of the woods, and not only did we have that devastation, but also the loss of able-bodied men. A lot of war widows are left behind, things like that. There's great out-migrations of people from the Carolinas after the war. People moved westward. People moved to Texas. People moved to Georgia, simply looking for a new start following the war. We have the exhaustion of the virgin pine forest, which also led to immigration. Many workers migrated south following that industry into South Carolina, into Georgia, into Florida, as we're going to hear about one of the immigrant party doing as well. We also, in that period, we saw a great out-migration of the Lundy population as well, who followed that industry down south, particularly a large community around Statesboro, Georgia. A lot of you are going to know the actress Heather Locklear, and came out of that community, people that were rooted here. So just an example of that out-migration of people that happened roughly around that time. And as a result, there's a lack of labor for a lot of agricultural pursuits and needs. We also have the fact that immigration from Scotland has slowed to a trickle or ceased since the 1830s to 1840s. There were some last parties that came out in organized numbers in the 1830s, particularly from the islands of Islay and Jura. But most of that immigration has trickled and faded away. And so the images of Scotland that people have in their minds here in North Carolina are tainted to some degree by the stories of Granny's Highland home, as well as being influenced by what they've read in the novels of Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott and Sir Walter Scotland, if you will, was the image that many people in this region had of Scotland, quite different in many ways from what the realities truly were. But that was the prime reading material for Southern males at that point, particularly during the antebellum era, to the point that Mark Twain blamed the whole Civil War on Sir Walter Scott and planting these crazy thoughts into the minds of Southern males. So what's going on in Highland Scotland in the early 1880s? Well, since the turn of the 19th century, we have a period which has been known as the Highland Clearances. And that was really precipitated by the introduction of black-faced sheep in large numbers to the Highlands. Landlords discovered that it was more profitable for them to raise sheep on land than it was to have rent-paying tenants who could only afford to pay so much. So we had people being cleared off during this period, roughly an 80 or 90-year period of time there, where people were sometimes very harshly treated. Either their purchases made for an immigrant ship and they're sent off, their homes burned down around them, they're relocated to the poorest land on an estate, whereas the landlords would keep large herds of sheep, maybe turn over part of their lands to deer forests for sport as well. Absentee landlords also grew disconnected with the estates and the people living on them. The great Highland chief of old is no longer living among his people. So that created a great disconnect. Most of the immigrants in the 19th century, certainly for the middle 19th century onward, are being directed to places in the British Empire versus the USA. That actually began around 1802, 1803 with the passage of the Passenger Act, which made it more expensive and more advantageous for folks to immigrate to places within the British Empire as opposed to coming here to America among all their cousins. Now, there are lots of immigration schemes which are offered, often to the disadvantage of those who are being removed. Now, in Canada in particular, there were great schemes to settle people along the western expanding railroads. So you'd have people that are being advertisements sent, agents sent out. We've got a great place for you, a lot of opportunity for you in Canada if you'll come and settle along our rail lines, things like that. There are cases where many of those people that were recruited out were slaughtered by the native populations, even. There are stories such as that. So some success stories, but a lot of very tragic stories as well. The agricultural system there, as it developed within the time of the clearances, was very disadvantageous to those living on the land. There developed a system called the run rig system of farming and land subdivision, which allowed small strips of land, small strips of cultivated land which were allotted to tenants within a township. You might get switched from one strip to another from year to year. So you had no incentive to fertilize, to improve your land, things like that. It's very disadvantageous, very poor land that these people were pushed off to. The former rent-paying tenantry that could only afford to pay so much were oftentimes pushed to the worst land possible. We can see why the people that came out here in the 18th century and early 19th century came out in much better condition than the people that were left behind and did not come out until later in the 19th century. Rents continue to be exorbitant to the tenantry, grazing lands are taken away, and there's overall dissatisfaction which grows among that tenantry. It's a great event which occurred April 19th, 1882. We're coming up on an anniversary of that event. The Battle of the Braes, it's called, where the tenantry finally make a stand against the landlords. Now imagine, if you will, you see these images, the Braes in the Island of Skye, a group of townships which are located just south of the village of Portree, 5 neighboring townships. And imagine, if you will, you've got a road that enters into this row of townships. On one side, drops off into the Sound of Rossing, water, cliffs. The other side rises up to some height, a mountain called Glenelg, which had been used for grazing lands for many years. What happened was Lord McLoud had raised the rents on the citizens in the townships of the Braes. and they finally had enough of it. They had agreed to pay the rents. They were a bit lax and late in getting those rents paid, but they'd agreed to pay an increase in the rents, which actually took away part of that mountainside, that grazing land that they had. They agreed to pay it, but Lord MacDonald decided, no, I'm not going to renew these leases for this land. So he sends his factor, his agent, down into the townships with an eviction notice. Several of the men that are deemed agitators, the whole township gathers around as the factor Alexander MacDonald rides down into the township, and he passes through, and the people are booing and hissing him, and the group finally gathers at the end, and they deforce him. They take the eviction notice, they drop it in a peat fire, and send him on his way. A statement, a tremendous statement made. The first time anything like this has truly happened in Highland history. So Lord MacDonald decides he can't do this. He orders up a company of Glasgow policemen, a detachment of Marines are sent, and the group marches later down into the townships of the Braes. They're going to get these agitators, they're going to take away the people that have been organizing the rent strike and arrest them. Along the way, as they enter into this township, there's a young man who has a signal, waving a flag to let everybody down at the end of the road know when the force is coming. That schoolhouse roof where the man stood, the schoolhouse, the Braes School, now it's the community center in the township of Braes, was built through funds that were bequeathed to that township by a man from Marlborough County, South Carolina, just across our state line. A man called McDermott, still known as McDermott School. So it played a part in that. So there were connections, Carolina connections there. The force comes in, led by the factor and the policemen, and the men and women get into a great melee with the Glasgow policemen and the Marines. They hurl stones, they throw chamber pots, full chamber pots. They hurl sticks and stones against this force coming in, but they take away the 5 agitators. 3 of those 5 agitators in just a few months ended up in Laurinburg, North Carolina. One of the very important events in Highland history, and it has a Laurinburg connection that's not well known at all. This is the monument that was put up a number of years ago in the township of Braes, and you can see the hill back here. That's part of Glenelg, the area that these folks would have grazed their sheep, grazed their livestock on, which was taken away from their renewed lease. And here you see the monument. The wording was produced in both Gaelic and English by the late great Sorley MacLean, the great bard and poet on the Island of Skye, Nobel Prize nominated poet, I might add, more on him later. And the lady standing beside this sign is a lady named Liz McNockature, who is from the Island of Skye. I'm going to say hello to Liz because she's going to be listening tonight from Scotland. Her grandfather was one of the men that came out here to Laurinburg, and he was the first man that went back to tell the story about what had happened. So more on her ancestor a little bit later. But the Battle of the Braes made worldwide news. Worldwide news. It was picked up here in Carolina as well. Made the newspapers here. In fact, I found a reference to this being mentioned in a Moore County newspaper, the Carthage Gazette, roughly after it happened. So people, the Scots in this area, were aware of what was still going on in their homeland. And so they became attuned to it and wanted to see what they could do, perhaps to assist these people. I have a very interesting book here called The Americans at Home. This is part of our old and rare collection here at St. Andrews that came from the Flora MacDonald College. It's authored by a man called the Reverend David McRae. David McRae was a very prominent Presbyterian minister from Dundee in Scotland. He was a very avid Scottish nationalist. And one of the things that I've read he is sort of important for is the fact that he led a movement which led the British government to make sure that they deemed things as British in documents as opposed to English, including the Scots, things like that. David McRae was a tourist as well. He wrote this book, The Americans at Home. It's all of his journey throughout North America. In 1867, 2 years after the American Civil War. Now he has within this book a chapter about Sherman's bummers, all the stories that were collected about Sherman's army going through things like that, followed by 2 chapters in it on his visit to the Highland settlement. Not only giving some information about and anecdotes about the use of Gaelic, the history of the settlement, what its current state is, what sort of cultural retentions there still are here and are not. But he noted within this, as you see in the quote, I found most of them temperate in their views of slavery, some of them even glad that it was gone, and anxious now to have white immigration in order to get free labor fairly tried. One planter said that if them Scotch families went out, he would give them 20 acres of land apiece, free of charge, merely to have them settle on the plantation and introduce the Scotch method of farming. Now one can look at that quote in many ways. 10 acres and a mule, or 40 acres and a mule. You've heard that story, things like that. One wonders, land is valuable, even though ours wasn't maybe as great as some places in the state, but give them 10 acres of land free of charge. It almost sounds too good to be true. But to have them settle on the plantation and introduce the Scotch method of farming. Now, if I'm to look at that from 2 different ways, one, is he looking to be this person that wants to offer 10 acres of land, is he looking to be a Highland lord with Scots living on his plantation, just as his forebears, perhaps? Or is there something going on in Scottish agriculture that would be beneficial to them here in the United States, or North Carolina in particular? Let's take a look. This is the Scotch method of farming. The item that you see on the left, cast chrome, is a foot plow. Nothing like the agricultural implements that we had here in North Carolina at that time. That is a foot plow. That's the way people would till these little strips of land, which you see. That's a run rig system right there. You see the little raised bits of land there, the lazy beds there. That's what you get to produce what you had to make your family subsist on for a year. And you may not get this one. You may be switched down there another year, or back there, or wherever. Scotch method of farming? That's a very, very curious comment to me. Obviously shows a lack of knowledge on both sides, I believe. So, how did this come about? There's a woman from Dundee named Miss Margaret McLoud who visited among this area, visiting relatives, around the late 1870s, early 1880s. She spent about 2 years here, the newspaper accounts say, with her relatives, and during that time she met James L. Cooley, our man in the center here. And how many descendants of J.L. Cooley do we have in the audience? I know there's several. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, very good. Footnote this. James L. Cooley had come to Richmond County at that time, now Scotland, from the Hillsborough area following the Civil War. I'm told that he was not only a progressive farmer, but also was a harness maker as well. During her visit, she evidently corresponded a great deal with him, visited with him, and they developed the idea of bringing some of these oppressed Highland crofters to North Carolina. Have them settle among us. You know, there's an old Burns saying, you know, was like us, you know, damn few and they're all deed. You know, best to have some people set among us like us. Why not? It's a great idea, great thought. Factoring into this as well is the Honorable D.P. McEachern. And I'm just going to use the traditional way of saying his name there. And you'll notice on the photograph there, one of the unusual things that we find among some documents here referring to Highland Scots. Instead of writing M-A-C or M-C, they simply put M apostrophe there on that. D. Daniel Purcell McEachern, who's the descendant, obviously, as his name implies, from Highland folk as well. He was the man who lived at the Mill Prong Plantation, just north of Wagram. He and James L. Cooley become the major players in this story. John T. Patrick, on the right, rather wild-looking man to some degree there. John T. Patrick was the son of a Scot from Wadesboro. He was a newspaper man, had a newspaper that he operated there in Wadesboro, but he became very interested in developing the Sandhills region of North Carolina. So much so that through his activities, he was eventually appointed immigration agent for the state of North Carolina's Department of Agriculture. All right? The state of North Carolina at this time was experimenting and trying to find out ways to bring people into the state that would benefit use and cultivation of all our natural resources, to fill up vacant lands, things of this nature. John T. Patrick is a very important man. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But John T. Patrick is engaged by D.P. McEachern through his own political connections. He's a state senator, D.P. is, to become involved in this. You know, the state at that point was primarily looking at recruiting domestic immigrants. They actually had offices in Boston, Chicago. They sent people out to state fairs, to agricultural fairs, touting the benefits of coming to North Carolina. A lot of people came in from Pennsylvania. A lot of New England farmers came in. There was, however, one effort at foreign immigration. There was a group of about 30 families of English people, English farmers, who came to northern Richmond County, called the Gardner Colony. They sort of fade into history, if you will. Not a lot's been written about them, but if you've been to Rockingham, you'll see some street names which allude to some of those families. The name Entwistle, it's not one here around here, Entwistle. The name Warburton, very atypical names that one finds right here. But all these people were part of the Gardner farming colony. So there had been an effort. Some people would come voluntarily to settle here. So maybe an idea that the idea of James L. Cooley and D.P. McEachern might perhaps succeed. So Cooley arranges a meeting of local farmers to see if there's interest in this movement. And there obviously is among the farmers of Robeson and Richmond counties at that point. So the effort moves forward with funds being collected. Now, Miss McLoud from Dundee has been writing back and forth to J.L. Cooley. And this is part of a letter that was published in the Fayetteville Observer a little over a year before the first immigrants arrived. She says, in a recent letter to Mr. Cooley, she, Miss McLoud, represents the condition of the poorer classes of the Hebrides as pitiful in the extreme, much worse than the poorest Negro that roams the sandhills of Richmond or picks huckleberries in the swamps of Robeson. Obviously some politically questionable language and all there. It wouldn't be considered appropriate these days, but you see the image we're starting to get. Poor people, they need our help. Right? This is a picture. These are typical Skye people planting potatoes. You see them there with their foot plows. Men and women like this. That's the kind of people that they were trying to recruit and bring over. These are people that are pushed to the worst land in the direst of situations. They've had enough, and they're looking for opportunities. D.P. McLoud, after there's a lot of newspaper exchanges about this whole movement, this is the best opportunity we ever had, or will ever have, to secure a good, hard laboring class of population. Do we want them? Yes. Have we room for them? Why, bless your soul, man, you might empty the whole of Skye into Robeson County, and there'd be room for all of Isla and Jura to make themselves comfortable for a lifetime. If these Scotch but knew what was good for themselves, they'd move right over here and say no more about it. So you see the attitudes. You know, people like us, we want them. We will bring them up from the stump. Now, there's a great deal of interchange between Miss McLoud in her fundraising efforts in Britain to help bring out these people and the people here in North Carolina. But also she is working behind the scenes, as I found, through going through a collection of letters which still exist at the Clandonald Center at Armadale in Skye, which I visited in the summer of 1996 when I was doing the field work for this project. Number of letters there where she is actually writing Lord MacDonald's wife, trying to get money to help her get rid of people. We want to try to get rid of these agitators for you, these people that are troublesome for you, these people that are causing difficulties for you. Won't you send me some money so I can help you get rid of them? And on the other side, she's talking to these people and telling them, oh, no, I am not in collusion with the landlords, not at all. I haven't met them. In fact, in one of her letters, she says how much easier it was to me not to say that we had met personally. So a lot of collusion and intrigue going on here. But she says in one of her letters, I ask your cooperation in bringing before Lord MacDonald by wish to know if I may look to him for any money to pay for or help pay their passages, as this has to be got up by subscription. I'm looking forward to each of the proprietors doing as much as possible to help in paying for these families who leave their property. I am led to believe Lady Matheson was willing to do this, but she has not the good fortune to get rid of any from Lewis, i.e. any families, though 10 or 12 young men are going, but as yet no families have accepted the offer made them. Skye and Lewis were the places where the Crofter agitation was growing. There were similar rent strikes and revolts going on in Skye and in Lewis that were inspired by the stand that was made by the people at the Battle of the Braes, as they call it there. So these people are agitators, they're troublemakers. So she's trying to get these troublemakers out under the guise of, I'm here to help. On that. There's a lot of different ways of interpreting and looking at this material. But in any event. So, through subscriptions, which included not only landlords from the Isle of Rosse, from the Islands of Orkney, under the table money from Lord MacDonald, contributions to many of the major Presbyterian churches in Scotland, including St. Giles and St. Cuthbert's in Edinburgh, and others. Dundee was a center for this as well. They collected money to help bring these people out, pay their passage, clothe them, give them whatever they were going to need for the passage, where they would be delivered and set up with people on this side, organized by James Cooley, D.P. McLoud, who would distribute them out among the families who needed folks to work for them. All right? So, these people leave Scotland in late February of 1884. But what's going on in Richmond County at that time? On February 19th, 1884, just days before these people came in, there were a series of tornadoes which swept through Richmond County. There were 44% fatalities, it was noted in the newspapers, in the path of those storms. Now think about an event that happened almost 100 years later, 1984. We know what happened here locally. The very same thing happened almost 100 years prior. And another big one. On the eve of February 28th, March 1st, there's a major fire in Laurinburg, which devastated most of the downtown. I know my friend Beecher McDougall wrote a post about that recently. I had found that as well. It was very interesting to note. These people had made their way across from Scotland. They'd gotten into Philadelphia. The group was originally coming over in one party. They were separated due to a ship having to turn back to rough seas, put on the two ships. Part came into Philadelphia, part came directly into Norfolk. The part that came into Philadelphia had to be shipped to Norfolk, where they were met by D.P. McEachern, James Cooley, and a man called Alexander MacArthur from Cumberland County. And I'm thinking that at least one of these men, perhaps MacArthur, had to be a Gaelic speaker. I don't know if there's any record of D.P. McEachern speaking Gaelic. I've certainly not heard or come across it, but it would have been needed because the men, it was reported, could speak English, but none of the women and children could. So someone was there, had to be there to be a voice for these people. But the three of these men went to Norfolk. John Patrick, state immigration agent, has gone to Philadelphia to meet those. He rides the ship down to Norfolk. They're all put on the train in Norfolk, make their way to Raleigh, where they're visited by reporters from the News and Observer there. They're put on the train from there to Hamlet, and as they're coming into Laurinburg for a grand celebration, which has been touted in the newspapers, James Cooley speaking, Livy Johnson. Somebody's probably going to know who that is from the Riverton community, I'm suspecting. Livy Johnson, anybody? All right. Was to give a great address on the benefits of North Carolina. The Reverend John Monroe, if anybody recognizes that name. John Monroe was a Gaelic-speaking Baptist minister. He was the understudy, if you will, of the late, great Daniel White, who was the progenitor of the Riverton community, Gaelic speaker that came over in 1806, founded Gaelic-speaking Baptist churches in Lumber Bridge, outside of Maxon at Mount Moriah, and also at Spring Hill in Weber. He was to be there. He was also one of the supporters and fundraisers on this side that helped out in the fundraising for this effort. But they're coming down from Hamlet on the train, 70 plus people, and they see a glow on the horizon. The newspaper, the Raleigh News and Observer, reports that they thought that a grand illumination had been gotten up in their honor for their arrival. The train was late. It was supposed to get in about 1 a.m. The train ended up getting in about 4 a.m. If you know where the train station was in Laurinburg, it was down really where Railroad Street and Main Street cross now, probably about where Shirt Tails business is, across the street from the old Mildred's Diner. Those people that remember Mildred Dupuy's Diner was the station hotel there. That's where these people got off, and they got off the train to see a burned town. There's supposed to be grand celebrations. James Cooley advertised looking for a bagpipe player. If anyone happens to possess, or even better yet, how to play the Scottish bagpipe, you'll find it of great benefit to contact me. In one of the newspapers he advertised. All of that was dashed. They arrived very late, simple greetings. The people were sent on to their homes, on to their host families. So imagine this: you've been at sea for 2 weeks. You had a week's crossing. You've been in Philadelphia. You've taken another boat to Norfolk. You've been on the train. These people have never ridden a train before, seen one. And you ended up in a town and it's burned down when you get off. Pretty dire sort of situation. All right. Now, here's the reports. They're fine, robust-looking fellows, but know nothing of our system of farming, but they're apt and industrious and will make first-rate field hands. That's James L. Cooley. In the Wilmington Morning Star, James L. Cooley even went to Wilmington, got a great donation from the mayor of Wilmington, because in Wilmington's eye, anything that helped build up the railroad and the lines along that were going toward Wilmington was good for Wilmington. So great funds were collected there to help bring these people out. Another man, Donald McPherson, and this man actually is one that ended up in Sanford. As the story progresses in just a moment. It's now I see the great error I did in spending the best of my days in Glenelg making up other people, but it's better doing a thing late nor never. In the meantime, I can only thank you for your great trouble in sending us here. And that was a letter that he wrote to Miss McLoud, the immigrant agent, that was published in the Scotsman newspaper in Edinburgh. Now, for the sake of those that are listening online, and simply for information here, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the people that came out. I'm going to read the list which have been compiled from the newspapers. Some of you in this audience are going to recognize names here. And some of you online are certainly going to recognize names as well, and I'd like to give you a shout out when I come to you. The first one, Donald McPherson, wife and children, Ewan, Johanna, Frederica, Donald D., and Duncan. They were billeted with D.P. McEachran at the Mill Pond Plantation. Alexander McKenzie and son Duncan. Now we know later that that was not his son, perhaps a relative, but Alexander McKenzie, and I have tonight with us here Kenzie Miller and Isabel Zimmerman are with us tonight. They are the granddaughters of Alexander McKenzie. So a special welcome to you all, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you and your connections to this story as we've met serendipitously through the years. All right. Murdo Murdy. Probably by that name I would suspect he's a Lewis man. Robert McDonald. Donald McIntosh. We know from newspaper accounts that he went to Maxton and he worked with F.W. Clark in the railroad office there. Angus McMillan, children, Catherine, Sandy, Katie, Mary, Isabella, and Angus. Miss Catherine Matheson. John Finlayson, a wife and 2 children. Ms. Isabella Finlayson, Peter and Annie as children. Frederick McKenzie, Marion, his wife. Alex, Malcolm, Gustava, George, and Donald were the children. John McKenzie, Jane, his wife. Anne, Malcolm, Johnson, and Murdoch were children's. Miss Alexander Nicholson and Alec Finlayson Sr. and his wife. Alexander McDonald, Mary, his wife. Lachlan, Duncan, and Simon, the children. Neil McMillan, who is the grandfather of a man called Ian Moyer, who you're going to hear about in a bit. Augusta, his wife. Marion was the child, and according to Ian Moore in my collections, they had another child that was born here in North Carolina during their stay here, who was killed in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. A special hello to Mary McDonald McQueen in Portree, Skye, who's listening tonight, and this is her great-great-grandfather. It's her grandfather, Ian Moyer, who I met and developed a great friendship with in my field work there. Donald Matheson, Flora, Augusta, Alex, his children. That family was located in Rockingham. He is one of the first 2 who left for Scotland in July of 1884. And hello there to Liz McNocketer in Scotland, as this is her grandfather, and I've had great correspondence with her, wanting to know more about this story that she was not as well aware of. Alexander Finlayson Jr., Kate, his wife, Donald, Alex, Christopher, Marion, Finley, Peggy were the children. They were located at the Bennett Farm, north of Rockingham. And Alec Finlayson was one of those 5 men who was arrested at the Battle of the Braes in 1882. He joins Donald Matheson in leaving for Scotland in July of 1884 to go back and tell the story of what's happened to them. Malcolm Finlayson, Mary, his wife, Finley, and Donald as children. Another man that was arrested at the Battle of the Braes. John Nicholson and James Nicholson, another man that was arrested at the Battle of Brace. Those are the 3 of the 5 men who were arrested there. Donald McPherson, John McKinnon, a wife and 4 children. Roderick McKenzie, a wife and 8 children. So these people are coming out with large families, expecting to start anew. Now, that first group that came in here to Laurinburg contained 30 persons from the townships of the Braes, which include the townships of Pennyhoran, Balmianach, Jedden Taylor, Upper and Lower Alloch, and also perhaps people from the township of Sconser, just across a wee bit of water from the south end of the Braes. And all of these people would have gone to school at the McDermott's school, the one that was financed by our local man from Marlborough County. Here's some quotes that were given as well at the arrival of these people. To say that we were agreeably surprised at the personal appearances of our Scotch friend is but a mild way of saying we were simply astounded. Now, how are they supposed to be so different? Yeah. Mr. Cooley was appointed immigration agent for the Seaboard Airline Railroad, embracing the Carolina Central, the Raleigh and Augusta Airline, and the Raleigh and Gaston and Seaboard and Roanoke railroads, and he will be looking out for the interests of those families who have arrived and make provisions for the further 20 families who have been booked already and will be sent on when arrangements can be made. Now, it says also there's the usual proportion of children from infancy up. As a body of people, they are unusually intelligent, all of a competent age being able to read and write. The men all speak English, but some of the women only know Gaelic. They all come, either from the free or the established churches of Scotland, the adherents being duly certified as well as full members of these churches. We regard this immigration as a capital scheme. Our state needs just such an addition to our population. So you see, they're like us, but wow, aren't they remarkable people? It's almost like they refer to them as specimens in a way. I mean, to me, it's a little paternalistic, or I don't know, it's odd. It's a little bit odd. When you talk about your neighbor like that, you know, when you talk about your cousin that's just arrived from California, you say, my, doesn't he look like a fine specimen? Perhaps. We know there were other arrivals though, and I want to go ahead and take you through some information about them. In May 10th, there's arrival of a second party which went to Sanford. And they were, again, the organization was made by James Cooley, obviously with people within the Sanford area. Most were located in the communities around the Pocket Presbyterian Church there. These are the folks that ended up there. Colin McCrae, a wife and children, Roderick, Joseph, Annie, and James. This family we'll hear about in a moment because they're still known in the island of Lewis as the Carolina McCraes. Angus Mackay, wife and children, Hugh, Catherine, Euphemia, Samuel, Neil, Alex, Jane, John, and Archie. Hector McKeever, wife and children, Donald, Annie, Murdoch, Hector, John, Christina, and another John. The newspaper actually notes that sometimes you will find people the same name within one family, be it a Gaelic patronymic, perhaps given otherwise to them, or something that would differentiate them. Roderick McPherson, wife and children, Neil, Alex, Donald, Delina, John, Lachlan, Duncan, Margaret, Mary, and Farker. And he is a friend of a man called Alex McCrae from Glenelg that we're going to hear about later as well. And Alexander McCrae, wife and children, Murdoch, Anne, Duncan, John, Alec, Roderick, Catherine. And we're going to hear a lot about them in a moment because there's a lot of subliminal things that you don't know about this family that are going to be revealed in a while. So that's a bit of those. Donald McKinnon, wife and children, Catherine, Christina, John, Janet, John again, and Alex. John McLoud, wife and children, Murdoch, Norman, Anne, Mary, Malcolm Murray, Donald Murray. On May 18th, the newspaper reports of 10 more with no names. June 27th, 5 more bound for Laurinburg. 12 more come from the islands of Orkney. All right? On July 9th, 1884, only about 3 months after they arrived, Alexander Finlayson and Donald Matheson leave for Scotland. Talk about that in just a moment. So, these people have been split up over large periods of large spaces of land. In one of the newspaper accounts, one woman notes we are 13 miles from one town and 16 from the other. And that's one of the ones in Richmond County. So I'm assuming that's probably somebody that's between Laurinburg and Rockingham. All right, someplace. All right. We know there were folks in Laurel Hill. We know there were folks that went to Maxton. We know that there were folks that went various places in Richmond County, as well as here in Laurinburg. We know that there were folks at the Mill Pond Plantation. We know that there were folks here. Those of you that are Anna McMillan locally, the house that she lives in, I'm told was the house of a woman named Polly McNeil, who took in 2 young men, including Isabel and Kinsey's grandfather, Alexander McKenzie, and his relative or cousin or something, Duncan McKenzie as well, and felt like they were like sons to her. She was corresponding about how wonderful they were and they wish they were more like them, that they would send on along. So to split over large, now what do you think that does to their community? Here's people that lived in 5 townships in the Braes, and probably about as large as the St. Andrews campus. They all corresponded with each other, saw each other, chatted with each other, farmed with each other, and now you're miles and miles apart. You don't have a whole lot of reinforcement. Say, if you're a family, your wife speaks no English. Who do you have to talk to? You know, the men are out working. You're there taking care of your children or doing whatever. If you're a housemaid or you're working in the field, whatever, who do you have to communicate with? That was one of the downfalls of this whole effort. Now, there was great dissatisfaction which began to be noted only a few weeks into the effort. Now, the newspapers recorded a lot of very positive remarks initially from Cooley, from McEachern. There are letters which are sent back to Scotland, which are printed in Scottish newspapers and thus reprinted in American newspapers, telling about how great things are, and we've been hosted by a family, Mr. So-and-so and so, and he's so great to us. Great articles about James L. Cooley, about what a gentleman he was. They feel safe if they're within 100 miles of where Mr. Cooley lives. So some great relationships that are built, but also some dissatisfaction as well. Because some of these people wrote back to their minister, one of their ministers in Skye, talking about not being able to find suitable work. The minister was a man called Reverend John Darragh. John Darragh was very familiar with the United States. He visited here, went to school here. In fact, he wrote an article about North Carolina Scots for the Celtic magazine in 1876, and it's to him that we owe a very little known anecdote about a Gaelic song which supposedly existed in Skye called "Gone to Seek a Fortune" in North Carolina. He records this 1876. Nobody knows anything about it. There's no song that really matches up to that. But he records it. He was familiar with the history and background and perhaps even visited this area. All right? But they wrote to him, so he writes to the British consul in Charleston and says, how can you help my people? They're in this place in North Carolina, it's just across the state line. They can't seem to find work. What can you do for them? Well, that got picked up by the Columbia reporter for one of the newspapers, for the Augusta newspaper there. No work to be found in North Carolina for these people. It hits Augusta, it hits Atlanta, it hits the New York Times, it hits papers in California. These people in North Carolina have brought these people out, but there's no work for them. They need to come where we are. Even as local as Chadburn in Bladen County, they're saying, hey, if you send these people down to us, we'll find work for them. That sort of thing. But some of these people were very dissatisfied in the beginning. We know that there's some that made off well, some that probably had better circumstances than others, some that had high expectations of what they were going to find, perhaps being fed by images of cowboys or New York City or city life in America, images of southern gentry and planters, things like that. Images on both sides as to what they were going to get. It's probably fed into that dissatisfaction. Here's what it was said. Matheson and Finlayson went back to Scotland in July. They've arrived there by the end of the month, and a great meeting is held at the Free Church, the Free Gaelic Church in Glenelg. And there's a great meeting held. And they tell the story. One of them speaks in Gaelic, one of them speaks in English. They tell about what all's happened to them here, about how they were duped, how they were coerced by this immigrant agent to come out to North Carolina. But it wasn't all that they told that it was to be. They were told that they were going to be given land, they were going to be given clothing, homes, they'd be given land. There was a Gaelic-speaking minister who could minister to them. Didn't say that he was 86 years old at the time. Little details like that. This is the sort of thing that immigrant agents played on for Highland Scots for years. All sorts of false promises, if you will. So in any event, when they came back, they told their story. Here's some of the things they said. Said where the work was obtained, the only wages given was the bare food, and the houses provided were the one-room huts, as they remarked, formerly occupied by slaves. That was in a synopsis of this whole incident that was given at the Gallant Society of Inverness, published in 1885. And here's one that comes from one of the newspapers just following that meeting. It says, on reaching America, they found that instead of provision for a whole year having been made for them and their families, nothing of the kind had been done. And all that they got to eat was some Indian meal, some treacle, and some flour. Now let's look at Indian meal, we know, cornmeal. Treacle, under the Scottish term, we're probably looking at either honey or molasses there, and some flour. One of them stated that he'd been put to ditch digging, and all he could make was about 3 shillings 6 a day. The other speaker had been connected with farm work, and all he could earn was about $8 a month. That's the testimony of these two men that went back. So it all blows up from there. Newspaper accounts questioning back and forth. This whole incident makes the Oban Times, all the northern newspaper, what's going on in North Carolina. People start pointing fingers. Well, who's responsible? Who's responsible? What's happened? What can we do to help these people? All these poor men were looking to raise funds to bring their families back home. And that it all blows up and ends on that side at least. And what were the reasons for dissatisfaction? Well, they're dispersed over a wide area. You don't have community reinforcement and fraternity. Look at the distance between Laurinburg and Sanford, for one. Okay. You've got two groups of people there. A lack of work skills or trades which coincided with our local agricultural needs. People hadn't seen Indian corn, our corn. They hadn't seen cotton. They'd smoked tobacco, but never seen it. Grown, probably. A lot of things that were obviously quite different. Cultivate a field. They see these grand fields here. They're not having to do it with that foot plow. With the great agricultural machinery we have. Things that they're simply unfamiliar with. One of the very important things was an unfamiliar climate. A lot of the people noted that it was much warmer than the Highlands and was telling on their health. Be here in July and August. You all know. A lack of Gaelic-speaking neighbors, as was expected and promoted. In fact, there's a letter here that I have, one of the last letters that was sent to D.P. McEachern before the first group left, hoping that Mr. Cooley would help DP in organizing some Gaelic learners classes so people would be able to communicate with these people, as also to assuage their fears on arrival of the African American community, because most of them had never seen a black person before as well. Right. Stories like this are very important. being relegated to menial labor tasks, such as ditch digging. These people expected better. They wanted to come over here, they thought they were going to be put up and they're going to make something of themselves. And they're being put to tasks which are former slave labor tasks, perhaps, and association with those tasks, which had been formerly occupied by African American labor. So there's, as you can see, a lot of reasons for dissatisfaction that these people would have had from the Scottish side. Also dissatisfaction on the American side as well, because of their frustration with these issues, as well as the fact that evidently a lot of the people that came out may have been depressed. You might imagine being depressed coming out in something like this. As you'll see, some comments are going to perhaps echo a bit later. It all failed to the greatest degree. Being fishermen, they proved a miserable failure with a few exceptions, and they have all returned to Scotland except these few. You ask how they got back. I don't know, but back they went. I have no doubts that a better class of immigrants would have proved a success. These Skye crofters are a good deal like the Irish land leagues, hard to satisfy and not worth much after being satisfied. You know, we've gone a long way from you can empty all of Skye and Islands, you're in Robeson County, to they're not worth much after being satisfied. You can see there's a great deal of difference in those opinions over a short time. But, as it said, with a few exceptions, including Isabel and Kenzie's grandfather. We'll talk about them in just a moment. All right. There were a lot of letters exchanged that were printed in the newspaper. Here's a man here that was an immigrant from the Muir of Ord in Inverness. As you know, that's north on the Black Isle there. February 19th, 1885, a year roughly after this, where he was given a glowing report of his experience, and Mr. Cooley noted, this man left February 1st for Georgia to take charge of a vineyard at $30 per month, washing, board, and lodging. I'll leave others to say if the Scotch immigration is a failure when the right kind of people come. We want no more fishermen or grumbling, drunken Skyemen among us 100 miles from the seashore, where there are no fish bigger than a minute. Now, yes, a lot of these people would have been fisher folk, the people that were living by the sea in Lewis and in Skye, certainly. Yeah, that would have been a trade. So where are you going to fish around here? I mean, it's simply an unknown trade. We have one that tried to pursue that. We'll talk about in just a moment. But in any event, you can see we've changed a great deal in our attitudes. It says grumbling, drunken Skyemen. Some of the letters that were exchanged and the newspaper accounts referred to the people that had been some of the agitators at Braes, and perhaps being the ones that were dissatisfied here. One might imagine, if you've been put through political turmoil, you've been shipped over here, and look at what you've got, you're living in slave cabins, it might very well drive you to drink. You know, one can only imagine that certainly there would have been some depression. What are we going to do from this point on? That's February of 1885. In December of 1885, there are newspaper accounts of two families which had been sent by their sponsors with a one-way train ticket to Durham. On Christmas Eve, they're living in a two-room house, 18 of them living with a black family who took them in because they were sitting on the dock of the train station at Durham. They knew nowhere else to go. They had no more money. They'd just been sent away. Same story comes a few months later from Norfolk. They've been sent back to the port where they came from. No way to get across back home, but sent them away. And I don't say this to necessarily reflect poorly on the people here, but what might one imagine? What might they do? It's a problem. You know, they're not satisfied here. Let's maybe send them onward to someplace where they might improve their condition, or they might be able to get work, or they might be able to do whatever. You can see it's a troubling situation. to say the least, for all concerned. For all concerned. But some very sad stories there. Now, why did this all go bust? I had a lot of conversations with the descendants of people who came out, and also with a man called Dr. James Hunter. James Hunter is one of the eminent Highland historians. He wrote a great recent book, in fact, his last book, on the Appin murder. Those of you familiar with Stewartsville Cemetery, you're going to know what the Appin murder is and how it's connected to local families. One of his very important books was The Making of the Crofting Community, where he talks about the development of this style of farming and land ownership through the years. A true expert in Highland history. And I had a chance to visit with him, meet with him in the summer of 1996 when I was doing my field work in Skye, collecting these stories. And this is what he said to me. And I take this, I don't mean this to be a poor reflection in any means, but I think it's quite true. He says, I'm quite sure that these real-life Highland crofters would have been far removed from the romantic images of the Sir Walter Scott Highlanders that must have been envisioned by the Highlanders of Carolina. Look at the image on the left. Victorian image Highlanders. And this is what people would have thought of if they're reading some of the Sir Walter Scott novels, the Waverley novels, all those things. We had great allusions, authentic allusions to authentic Highland folklore and things like that. But that's what they envisioned to some degree. That's an exaggeration, but you get the picture. This is what they got. It's a great image that I love. I love this image. Poor immigrants waiting for an immigrant ship. The Last of the Clan, it's called, in the middle, by Thomas Fade. And the image of a couple of Skye crofters there as well on the left. That's the reality. Those are the people that came here. Those are the people that came here. So, how did I find out about this? And what's important about it? I first found out about this story through a dear friend and distant cousin, James Roderick McDonald, Jamie, Big Jamie, Seamus Moore, as he's known to some of us, who was doing his PhD dissertation for the University of Edinburgh's School of Scottish Studies. And he visited with me, stayed about a week or so with me down at the lake house right here around the corner from us here, where I lived when I first started work here at St. Andrews as a host for a guest house. And then my friend Dan McNeil's parents certainly fed and put up with Jamie for a long time as well there as well during his research times here, collecting information. One night we're sitting in that lake house and he gives me a copy of a newspaper article. It says, have you heard anything about this? There's an article from the Wilmington Morning Star which told about these immigrants. And I'm looking at this is 1990. And I'm thinking, 1884, 1990, all right, a little over 100 years. Let's say some of these people came over as young people. There's perhaps people here that may have known these people, or may have known of these people. It's long before I met Isabel, long before I met Kinsey, long before I met these three men. What I was tasked to do in my master's thesis regarding this very unknown story was not only to document and tell the history of it, but to tell what the meaning of it was. What meaning is there in the story? All right? How many times do you have a situation where immigrants come from one place, go to another, and they're unsuccessful, and they get back home? We can liken that. I just heard a conversation at the beginning here about people crossing the Rio Grande. You've got your Hispanic immigrant that tries to get across. Well, he gets caught. Well, he's not successful. So he goes back. But there's not that much of stigma. He got caught. I'll try again. These people have given up. They sold everything. Lord MacDonald has bought out the belongings and the homes of the people that came out. They got nothing but to go back to. Nothing to go back to. So, again, this story of how do you think these people would have felt and looked on going back home? Are they going to come back with the heads hung low? We didn't make it, sad us. They ended up, in many cases, making it a triumph, which is very interesting. These three men who are pictured here, Ian Moyer, MBE, grandson of Neil Macmillan, Shirley MacLaine, the great gallant poet, Nobel-nominated poet, and historian on the Island of Skye, and Willie Nicholson, MBE, the grandson of John Nicholson, who came out here to Laurinburg, all shared a story with me, shared parts of a story, shared the last fragments of a story that once took 2 full nights to tell about the trip to Carolina. It was an epic. All of these men talked about an epic. They all remembered it growing up, because what happened in the later lifetime of these people, a lot of these people in the Highlands, as they're pushed out and all, a lot of them would have gone to Glasgow, gone to work in the shipyards, followed industries, things like that. Let's say a wife dies, things become tough for them. They send these boys back to Skye to their grandparents, or back to the islands, back home, so someone can take care of them while we build and work and try to make a better life. That happened in this case. Okay? Ian Moyer on the left, World War II veteran. He had brothers that he told me that he had a brother that was a pathfinder in the bombing raids. He had another relative, perhaps a brother, if I'm not mistaken, who flew a Mosquito. You know about World War II aircraft, the plywood fighter bomber. Shirley MacLaine was a scholar. He was not as involved militarily there. Willie Nicholson was a captain of a ship in the Romance convoys. He had ships sunk underneath him. Each of these men told a story about Ian Nicholson. He said he had come out to North Carolina, and they not only dealt with the heat, they'd come here and they were walking long distances, they dealt with heat. In the case of the women, as was the case with Ian Moyer, with his grandmother, she spoke no English. And he told me that the only person that she had to communicate with was the minister, John Monroe. And the minister would come and visit her and talk to her. They talked about when they got off of the ship and got off the train here in Laurinburg, they had walked to wherever they were staying. I'm not sure exactly where they were, but they walked a long distance. They stopped along the way and were offered a gourd of water by an African-American woman. They said nobody wanted to drink the water because it was the first African-American that they'd ever come into personal contact with. Weren't sure it was really right. It was stunning. It was remarkable to them. These sorts of things that were remarkable. The story told took 2 nights, and it said that one of the men there used to prompt them along the way. What happened was Ian our man John, leaves Laurinburg area. He somehow makes his way to New York City. He's had some sort of skin condition which has made him lose his hair. And so he sort of has an image of looking like perhaps a Germanic person, a German immigrant. So he's walking down the street someplace in New York, and he's looking in a store window, and the man comes out and he says, "You're a West Highlander, aren't you?" And it ended up the man was a Highlander as well. So he'd taken him in, evidently gave him shelter, some time there. Eventually he is able to get on board and work on a ship to book his way back over. He interviews for the job, and they ask him, "What ship did you serve on?" He gives them the name of the ship that he sailed over to North Carolina on, the SS Ohio. "Oh, the Ohio, you're hired." He had no previous shipping experience whatsoever. They told a funny story. This was told between Shirley MacLaine, who died just 4 months after I saw him there in 1996. I was very, very fortunate to have gotten that information from him. Shirley gets on the phone with his brother, Dr. Alistair, McLean, and the two of them start speaking in Gaelic and recounting, and they're laughing and laughing and laughing and laughing and laughing. And then he hangs up the phone and says, yes, said he told me, said the part of the story that I had forgotten was that they told him to ring 8 bells. And he only saw 1 bell, so he started ringing it loud as he could and kept ring, because he only saw 1. He didn't see 8 to ring. So little stories like that. This man made it home. He didn't go directly home though. When he arrived back in Scotland, he worked on a fishing trawler, Loch Fyne, the herring fishers there. Part of the season, he came back with £50 in his pocket, a hero with £50 in his pocket. He marries this girlfriend that he's left behind, and they live happily ever after. I was able to actually see the home that he had built after coming back from Carolina when I was over in 1796. All of these gentlemen were absolutely remarkable. They had me in their homes, as you can see. It's well before I turned as gray as I am now, but those were lovely times, and I've been fortunate to have been in communication with the granddaughter of Ian Moyer, other relatives of the Nicholsons. Was very fortunate again to have spent almost a whole day with Sorley McLean. Not only did he tell me what little bits he knew about all the people that had come out, but he also told me about my McQueen ancestors and how conceited and stuck up they were for centuries prior to that time. So, and this man could go, he had a tweed jacket on, as you can see. He put his arms in. John, son of Ian, son of John, son of, and he went just reciting genealogies. And I remember there's a couple of them says, Ian told me, said, oh, he's brilliant, but he bores the tears out of me. Sort of thing. But all great men. All these men were World War II heroes. They heard the stories of these men and what happened to them and how they made it back to Scotland. And to them, every one of them noted, not only was it such an epic story, but they all said they were survivors. And growing up, they taught us all to be survivors. And that's the way that we survived all the challenges that we went through. Again, recounting romance convoys, the British Army, just a tremendous thing how they used the story, which was very sad in many ways, but to their advantage, to build up fortitude as a reinforcement and a positive thing. So that was really the crux of my information that I collected. However, on returning, I was very fortunate to very serendipitously meet Isabel Zimmerman. In one of the newspapers that I found, about 1912, just scrolling through, and for some reason the old microfilm machine stopped. And it said that jovial old Scotchman, Alexander Mackenzie, visited with us in Wagram, something like that. He was talking about his marriage to his wife, who was one of the locals there. Alexander Mackenzie was a carterer, correct, Isabel?
Right.
He was a carterer. That's somebody that took the little cart in the town of Stornoway with goods, vegetables, produce, that sort of thing, from house to house, as a boy. And somehow he's got this image of America, he's gonna go. So he's one of those 10 men from Lewis, 10 or 12 men from Lewis, that were enticed to come out. Now his story is interesting, because he and his relative friend, another Mackenzie, are taken in by a lady called Polly McNeil. And Polly McNeil evidently sort of became a mother figure to a lot of these young men in the area, because we'll talk about her in another letter in just a moment. But very highly regarded. If the newspaper says, they talked about all the grumbling, drunken Skyemen. If the old country has any more such as the Mackenzie, she may send them right along. Now, I'm not sure, Elizabeth, some of y'all, Cornhill in the Richmond Rocket, was that JL? Do you know that was ever a pen name that he used?
Don't know.
I was thinking that it could have possibly been based on things I've seen there. That's our man. That's Alexander Mackenzie, and I think Isabel told me that here he is at a convention. He had sort of an interesting story. He left here and went down to Florida, where he purchased, was able to acquire a very sizable and substantive pine plantation outside of present-day Bradenton, Florida. And he'd done well for himself. He came back. He married his sweetheart that he had met here from the Wagram community. He takes her back. She develops malaria. And so sadly, he's done well for himself. He's finally reached that, like all these people are looking for. So he returns home, back to the Wagram area, actually to Robeson County. He goes down to the Burnt Swamp Township down around Bowie, where he builds a house. They live there. I think Isabel told me, said Grandpa wasn't much of a farmer, right?
Not really.
Yeah.
He had no experience in Scotland with farming.
Exactly. So
They
came
didn't
in
do it
and
there like they did it here, so he wasn't very successful as a
due to the
farmer.
time of the Depression, some family misfortune there. He relocates a number of places. There he's taken, I believe that picture was of him as a driver's license examiner, I think you told me, with the Department of Transportation in Kinston, was it? Kinston or Reedsville, Goldsboro, Burlington? Burlington.
Where was it?
Burlington, maybe, I think.
Burlington. Probably
Yeah.
Burlington.
Right.
Yeah.
That's our man. He's one of them. He's one of the very few who stayed.
Right.
And as you can see, he's got people that are still here. And a great story they have to tell, because when Isabel and I first met, they knew a bit about the story, but didn't know all the details of how this is really a pretty major thing. In my off time between classes, over the 3.5 years I commuted to UNC, I would sometimes leave Laurinburg an hour early or stay an hour late, and I went through every newspaper that was existent from this area, that covered this area, for the years 1883 through 1886. That took a lot of doing, I can tell you. It was a long process. But I found that this whole incident was one of the biggest news stories in those years in terms of southeastern North Carolina. This is, I think, one of the most interesting artifacts, or relics, if you will, of this, because this is a personalized coat of arms that Isabel tells me her grandfather drew, representing himself. Now, Tulakard, Mountain and Cattell, Kulik and Reed, very similar to not only the cap badge of the old Queen's Own and Seaforth Highlanders that would have been from the island of Lewis and that region, recruited in that area, but also the Clan Mackenzie, the arms of the Clan Mackenzie. But look at what's different about it. You got a Salter cross on the right, and on the left, a Confederate flag. And as Isabel told me, she said that that was his representation of who he was and who he had become. And I think that is truly one of the great testimonies to the success of the very few people that stayed. It's a terribly interesting story. Now, we've got one that's very well known, subliminal. Alexander McCrae and his family came from Glenelg to Carolina. The picture that you see on the left came from a photo album from a grandson of his that I, again, serendipitously came across after my return from Scotland in '96. That's a picture of the fishing boat that this man owned that he sold to book the passage for his whole family to come out to North Carolina. This is Alexander McCrae. At the McCrae House, a guest home which they built, a 14-room guest home, which they built on the site of present-day McCrae Meadow, the site of the annual Grandfather Mountain Highland Games. Very serendipitous. Talk about his story in just a moment there, but there's, again, a picture coming from there. Look at that different terrain and everything there. And there he is, playing the pipes in the mountains of North Carolina. He became a newspaper A lot of people would visit, they would make reports about this man playing the bagpipe. They said that when they had guests in the home, they would empty out the kitchen and they would dance. They would play the bagpipe. They would do dances. They would sing Gaelic songs. They'd have local musicians come in and join them. Anybody that knows anything about the Scottish ceilidh tradition will know that ceilidhs take place in the kitchen. That's exactly what went on there until the 1920s. Here's another picture of this man. Look at the big man he is. Look at him on the left there, behind the draft horse. Many of you have driven up what is the old Yonawasi Road from Linville up the mountain to Grandfather Mountain. He was the foreman that built that road. And here he is pictured in his plus fours. Look how Scottish that looks. In his plus fours with his hose there. That's taken about in what's the middle of present-day McCrae Meadow, the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games. Alexander McCrae had come in to Sanford with the second group that came in May. He's there for a short period of time, and he and a friend, Donald McPherson, decide they're going to set off on their own. And they purchased adjoining tracts of 100 acres of land very near where Highway 74, old Highway 74, and the railroad crossed just south of Pembroke, an area that they used to call the wasteland. Because if you've ever been down there, it is truly wasteland. Sandy, now you find it in row crops, things like that. You know, so far removed from that or Scotland, you can hardly imagine. He too was not a successful farmer. He and his family pack up. They decide they've got to get closer to the sea, back to something he knows. They go to Wilmington, where he is found supposedly on the street one day, busking, playing his bagpipe. And he's come across by a man called Hugh McCrae. And you're going to recognize that name, Hugh McCrae, who is not only descended from the great blockade running family of Wilmington and earlier colonial settlers that came from Kintail, were settled in Moore County, then back to Wilmington. Anyway, they've come across him and they said, boy, we have just the right thing for you. They took him up to lands that they had purchased, 16,000 acres or better, I think it was, that they purchased to create the resort community we now know as Linville. They owned all of Grandfather Mountain. This man was the caretaker. He was the man that took the horse bridle paths up the mountain, operated the guest house, took the tourists up there. His sons operated the toll road, which went between Linville and Blowing Rock, now the old US 321, basically there. So again, people think that there are all sorts of Highland people that settled in the mountains because there's Highland games there. This is the only one. True Highland man. True Highland man from Glenelg in the West Highlands, but he was the only one. He was the only man there. I've got some pictures up here you can see afterwards. He had two of his sons, Alec and John, which lived until the 1960s. One made little bark birdhouses similar to the houses that you see at the East Yellow Lodge and the homes at Linville there. Sold them at a roadside stand. The other one operated a little greasy spoon diner, I think. They said about the only thing he was good at making was cheese sandwiches. But the two of them were there. They were known characters around that community. They said they'd oftentimes get apart from people and they'd whisper to each other and they'd talk to each other in Gaelic. You can often wonder they're probably saying things they don't want people to hear. They're talking about other people, these crazy mountain people. So we got great stories. Not only great stories that the gentleman from Skye told me, the story of Alexander Mackenzie, the story of Alexander McCrae, the story of many others who are probably viewing this, that are going to hear about this. I wish I knew more about Alexander Finlayson and others who were here. There's just not information on this side, and the family evidently does not know that much about the time in Carolina that was told on that side either. Because, again, this next generation, these men that I interviewed there were in their 80s. They're all gone now. And these were the last generation that came up without television, without radio, where they had, that was their entertainment, two-night story that they loved to hear. about Carolina. So things like that stuck in their minds. We often wish that we had more of that. But there's untold stories. From Stornoway Lewis, same place that Isabel and Kenzie's grandfather came, is a man called Murdoch MacDonald. Murdoch MacDonald was taken in by a war widow. I think it's a war widow, at least a widow lady, named Connolly, who lived in the Antioch community. I think her name was Mary Bethune-Connolly. He was very content and happy to work for her as a farm manager for her there from the time that he came in. I found a collection of papers down in Red Springs a number of years ago, and there was a fragment of a letter there that had been sent to Miss Polly McNeil by this man's mother in Lewis. Can you tell me what happened to my oldest son? We don't know whether he went out to Manitoba with a lot of people here, or possibly he may have come to you. He ran away from home. We didn't know what happened to him. His brother that he's never met writes him in the 1930s saying, "Brother, we've never met, but it would be great to see you. Won't you come home?" This man's been working for nice ladies, widow ladies, managing a farm. He manages the roads. He's contracted with the state to manage the roads in the Antioch community, oversee the roads. He's an elder at the Antioch Presbyterian Church for all his life. He's remembered by the few people that told me they remembered him as a man that sat around at the little country store drinking as many small Coca-Colas as he could drink in a city. And he talked funny. But here's a man, look at, a friend to all. His family didn't even know where he went. Among his papers was a foreclosure note from the 1930s from a tract of land that he had bought in Texas as one of the cattle companies, hoping to have that dream of becoming a cowboy, perhaps. And it never happened. Never happened. He died a bachelor, tucked away in the back of the cemetery at Antioch Church. But he was the only man of this group that stayed where he was planted when he arrived in 1884. So, the aftermath. The aftermath. Let's talk about what happened just for a moment here. What happened to all of these people? We don't know. We know that a lot of them went back. I had the good fortune of speaking to a woman by telephone. She would not let me visit her personally. But a woman that lived in the Braes whose father was one of the immigrants. This is in 1996. She said that her father was quite aged when she was conceived by a second or later marriage. So still, the daughter of one of these people, she says, all I know is they all went out to Carolina and they all came back. Okay. So what happened? As a result of this effort, there are great questions which are brought into play about the worthiness of the Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Immigration. People wanted John Patrick's head because the state had invested a fair amount of money in paying the transportation by rail of all of these people from Norfolk, Virginia to either Laurinburg or Sanford. Okay, so there was financial investment on part of the state of North Carolina at that time. There had been other immigrant groups which had come in and were not quite successful. There was a group in southern Moore County of Swiss and French who bought 5,000 acres of land to establish a silk colony by 1885. And it came to nothing. There were great parties of people who hoped to establish vineyards, great vineyards, as the soil was similar to some places in France. They saw this going to be the great place for vineyards. Again, a failure. The state had again sort of put a bit of encouragement there. The state finally comes down. No more encouragement for foreign immigration. And you think of all the foreign immigrants, Eastern Europeans, others that are coming into all sorts of places. We don't have passenger sailing lines that are coming into Wilmington or Charleston. So There was some talk about establishing those should this have been a great success, bring more UK immigrants to come in here. All of that's discontinued. No more support whatsoever for foreign immigration. It all turns domestic. And one of the big things that happens is that John T. Patrick is able to redeem himself. 2 years after the failure of this movement, he is able to establish a village called Glenelg in Moore County, which is a colony for northern journalists who can come and enjoy the good weather and the good waters. Glenelg eventually is incorporated as the town of Southern Pines and the growth of the resort industry, thanks to John T. Patrick. John T. Patrick he's got a community named after him in Chesterfield County, Patrick, South Carolina, named after this man, named after John T. Patrick. A great developer, encouraging, at one point it was said in the newspaper that there were as many as 150 people coming from Pennsylvania a month to settle here in North Carolina. So his domestic efforts were successful. He also focuses on trying to develop the growing tourism industry. He is a great proponent and suggests that a great highway be built that will connect Asheville with Charlotte, North Carolina, and to go by the scenic Chimney Rock. You might recognize what highway that is? That's the western part of Highway 74, which now continues parallel to that rail line all the way to Wilmington, Highway 74. Right? And then redeemed himself. He was able to redeem himself, save himself. D.P. McEachern continued his efforts politically, was a successful farmer, politician. As late as 1911, there are still people from Scotland writing him, asking about the advantages of North Carolina and how he might be able to assist them in settling here. 1911. Right? In 1905, there's an effort drawn together once again after the failure of this by a man called John G. Shaw. His son and grandson were longtime attorneys in Cumberland County, trying to again create a Scotch immigration society for the sake of recruiting people once again to this area among Highland people. Just 20 years before, it's been a failure. However, in later years, some people that are around Red Springs, North Carolina, will know of the Balfour family, and others that are there who are part of a smaller group of men that were recruited from people around the community of Red Springs. Part really of as I understand it, part of a Sunday school class of bachelor men from Edinburgh that came out, again, in another effort. One of those men went on to become a pretty prominent surgeon in Charlotte. One immigrated to Canada, but was in the Canadian Air Force in the war. All sorts of different stories about those men said. This was the most significant, not the last, however. There's still people that were here. And it's amazing as I look around this small group tonight, and I look at Elizabeth, and I look at Mr. Peden, and I look at Kinsey, and I look at Isabel, and I think, you wouldn't be here if it weren't for their people. And that's a pretty amazing story that's really and totally unknown. When I tried to find information about this here in town, there was nothing to be had in the late 80s, early 90s. And it took a whole lot of digging. But it's been very successful. I know that there's people that are watching tonight that are descendants of that group, people otherwise. The man that joined McCrae down at Pembroke, down below Pembroke there, his land was eventually foreclosed. He ended up in Connecticut. These people, who knows where they all went? We don't know where all of them went. We know the good many of them went back home. And there were stories about their time in Carolina. One of the families on closing, the Carolina McCraes, in the island of Lewis. Another one of the Lewis people that came out. I was in touch by letter with people that knew them, and they still know themselves as the Carolina McCraes because of their involvement in this movement and went back. So perhaps again a way of redeeming yourself. They said that all that they knew was their stories and their family, that while they were here, that they were picking oranges and bananas and apples. I thought curiously about that. Oranges, apples, bananas. That doesn't make sense. That they were part of the group that were located in northern Moore County. When you think about the growth of truck farming industry, which is starting roughly about that time. Here's what Cameron was famous for. The famous Cameron dewberries and things like that. So they could have perhaps been agricultural laborers that had some thoughts that got morphed through the years in these great stories of bananas and oranges and apples before they went home. On first footing of every night, New Year's Day, they go around to their neighbors' houses in the Island of Lewis still, singing the song to the tune of London Bridge. We're the men that fear no foe, fear no foe, fear no foe. We're the men that fear no foe, we're the Carolinas. And still known as Carolina Lewis. So there's some great connections. I appreciate y'all listening to me tonight. Be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. But I just am terribly touched by the fact that this morning I was messaged by a couple of descendants of this group who said that they were gathering to listen to this to find out more on that side, as well as to have descendants of folks who are involved in this right here together. And we can see there's 5 or 6 of you that wouldn't be here if we didn't have connections, as they did not happen in 1884. So thank you very much. I do want to conclude with one last slide there. As Jeff has mentioned, we are undertaking a new campaign here at St. Andrews. I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything else that you'd like to say at this point about that, but you can take a peek at that and find out more about what we're doing. As you well know, we had 34 inches of rain with Hurricane Florence in the basement of our cafeteria. We had a science building, the basement of which was destroyed. We have kids that are still eating their college meals out of 2 trailers that FEMA's provided you to get worn out. It takes a lot of money to get that sort of thing put back, and FEMA unfortunately let us down. You got to raise the money in order to get reimbursed to fix things. It's a real shame. But we're going to try. St. Andrews is very vibrant. Our enrollment has increased, continues to increase. We've got a better town-gown relationship that we've had in years. We're on the move. We're going to need some help to make it happen. So the United campaign will be going on here. We have $5 million to raise to be able to allow people to come back and meet in our adult center once again, which we can't do now. Allow our kids to be able to have meals in a real dining hall, to allow our science building to be refurbished and refitted here. So everybody's support's going to make that happen. And if we don't do it, then programs and things like this are going to go away. So we're here for the long run, though, and we appreciate your support of this event and all we do here at St. Andrews. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we finish up? No? If not, then I'll leave with this last image once again, and thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Yeah.
Can I make just a couple of announcements?
Yes, please.
This coming Sunday is our annual meeting at Mill Plantation House.
All right.
Here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and our speaker is going to be Nancy Strickland Chavis, director of the Museum of Southeast American Indians. She's going to be talking about the Indian communities that were there and the families that were there that the Gilchrist bought the land from. Then also on April the 27th, which is a Saturday, at 11 o'clock, we're going to unveil a North Carolina highway marker just south of Red Springs to mark Bowie Indian burial mound. So that's the first of the burial mounds that we're working on preserving. The mound is gone, but preserving the history of. So we've got other projects that we're going to be doing on the burial mounds. So I wanted to invite you about that. Everybody out there for these events.
Good. Good. All right. If nobody else has anything else, then thank you all for coming out tonight. our May program. I've discovered tonight we will be having one more program before we wrap up for the spring and summer, and that's going to be given by Blake Tyner back here. It's going to give us some history about Floral College. We started with the story of our earliest predecessor institution, and appropriate that we go Celtic full circle and finish up with something like that as well. So we'll be sending out things like that. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Tell your friends. It's going to be on.